Cowboys Lost Honor. Loretta Lori McBride had spent years trying to erase the memory of Jesse Hollister, the gunslinger who left her behind. But when he rode into town dust-covered, dangerous, and staring straight at her, she knew she'd never truly escaped him. He smirked, tipping his hat. "Miss me, darlin'?" he murmured. "Or just wish I'd stayed gone." Chapter 1. The Ghost Rides Back. The wind, a restless spirit itself, whipped through the dusty main street of Redemption, Arizona, carrying with it the scent of sun-baked earth and the faint, metallic tang of a coming storm. Loretta Lori McBride stood on the weathered porch of her general store, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the heat shimmered and distorted the distant mesas. 58 years she'd lived, and every one of them had etched its mark on her face, lines of laughter around her still bright blue eyes, furrows of worry on her brow, and a certain set to her jaw that spoke of resilience and a will that wouldn't bend easily. Her hands, roughened by years of work, gripped the porch railing, the wood warm and familiar beneath her touch. She'd built this life, brick by brick, board by board, after he left. The store was her sanctuary, a testament to her stubborn refusal to be broken. Shelves lined with canned goods, bolts of fabric, tools, and the thousand other necessities of frontier life stood as silent witnesses to her quiet triumph. The bell above the door, a cheerful, tinkling thing, had welcomed countless customers, each one a small victory in her ongoing battle against the ghosts of the past. But today, the wind carried a different scent, a familiar one that sent a shiver down her spine, the scent of leather, gunpowder, and something indefinably him. Her heart, a stubborn old mule that had refused to give up on her, began to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She told herself it was the coming storm, the sudden drop in pressure, the way the dust devils danced in the distance like restless spirits. But she knew. And then she saw him. He rode in slow, like he owned the whole damn territory, atop a magnificent black stallion that seemed to absorb the harsh sunlight. He was a silhouette against the fiery sunset, a figure from a half-forgotten dream, or perhaps a nightmare she'd never truly escaped. Dust coated his worn leather duster, his wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but there was no mistaking the set of his shoulders, the way he sat in the saddle, the sheer, dangerous grace of him. Jesse Hollister. The name echoed in her mind, a whispered curse and a forgotten prayer all rolled into one. 20 years. 20 years since he'd ridden out of her life, leaving her with nothing but a shattered heart and a belly full of regret. 20 years she'd spent trying to erase him, to bury the memory of his touch, his voice, the way he could make her feel alive with just a look. He stopped his horse in front of the store, the animal snorting and pawing the ground, its breath misting in the cooling air. He dismounted with a fluid ease that belied the years that had, if anything, only sharpened his edges, made him even more dangerous. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, just looking at her. The silence stretched, taut and humming with unspoken words, with the weight of all that had passed between them. The other townsfolk, those who were still out and about preparing for the approaching storm, seemed to sense the shift in the air. They stopped their work, their conversations dying in their throats, their eyes drawn to the scene unfolding before them like moths to a flickering flame. Old man Hemmings, who'd been whittling on the bench outside the saloon, went still, his knife frozen mid-stroke. Martha, the baker's wife, paused in the act of sweeping her porch, her broom held aloft like a forgotten weapon. Even the stray dogs that usually roamed the streets seemed to sense the tension, slinking away into the shadows. Finally he moved. He took a step, then another, his boots crunching on the dusty ground. He reached up and pushed back his hat, revealing his face. Time had been both cruel and kind. The boyish charm was gone, replaced by a hard-edged handsomeness. His eyes, the same startling shade of green as the desert sage after a rare rain, were etched with lines, with the shadows of things he'd seen, things he'd done. His jaw was firm, his mouth a thin, hard line. But there was something else there, too, something that made her breath catch in her throat. A flicker of vulnerability, Regret? He stopped a few feet from the porch, his gaze never leaving hers. The smirk she remembered, the one that had always made her heart flutter and her blood boil, was there, but it was different now, tempered by something darker, something sadder. He tipped his hat, the movement slow and deliberate. "Miss me, darlin'?" he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that sent shivers down her spine, not all of them unpleasant. The sound of it, after all these years, was like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of her. She wanted to slap that smirk off his face. She wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, to unleash all the pent-up anger and hurt she'd carried for 2 decades. She wanted to run into his arms and beg him never to leave her again. Instead, she stood her ground, her hands tightening on the railing until her knuckles were white. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with a defiance she wasn't sure she felt. "Or just wish I'd stayed gone," he added, the words a challenge, a dare, a question that hung heavy in the air between them. Her voice, when she finally found it, was surprisingly steady, betraying none of the turmoil raging inside her. "What do you want, Jessie?" He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to find something he'd lost, something he desperately needed. The wind picked up, swirling dust around them, creating a miniature vortex that seemed to mirror the chaos in her heart. The coming storm was a promise, a threat, a reflection of the tempest he'd unleashed within her just by riding back into town. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her carefully constructed life, her hard-won peace, was about to be shattered all over again. The question now was, would she be strong enough this time to weather it? Or would she finally be consumed? Chapter 2. Echoes in the Dust. The air inside the general store was thick with the scent of spices, coffee, and the lingering ghost of wood smoke from the pot-bellied stove that sat cold in the corner, waiting for the true chill of autumn. Lori had lit a single lantern, its flickering glow casting long, dancing shadows on the shelves, making the familiar objects seem strange and unfamiliar. She watched Jessie from across the counter, her arms crossed, a barrier against the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. He hadn't moved from the doorway, his presence filling the space, a stark reminder of everything she'd tried to forget. "What do I want?" He repeated her question, his voice low and rough, as if the words themselves were coated in the dust of the trail. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture surprisingly weary. "That's a question I've been asking myself for a long time, Lori." He finally stepped inside, the spurs on his boots jingling softly with each step, a sound that echoed the nervous flutter of her heart. He moved with the same easy grace she remembered, but there was a tension in his shoulders, a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He was a predator, she realized, but a wounded one, and that made him even more dangerous. He stopped at the counter, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of his skin, a mix of leather, sweat, and something uniquely him. It was a scent that triggered a flood of memories, unwelcome and yet undeniably powerful. She fought the urge to step back, to put more distance between them. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. "You left," she said, the words blunt and accusatory. "No word, no goodbye. Just gone." He didn't flinch. He just met her gaze, his eyes dark and unreadable. "I had my reasons." "Reasons?" Her voice rose slightly, a crack in her carefully constructed composure. 20 years, Jessie. 20 years I waited, wondering, hoping, and then finally accepting that you were never coming back. What kind of reasons could possibly justify that?" He looked away then, his gaze sweeping over the shelves, the familiar objects that represented the life she'd built without him. "It's a long story, Lori. A complicated one." "I've got time," she said, her voice hard. "And I think I deserve to hear it. Every damn dusty detail." He hesitated, then gave a short, sharp nod. "Fair enough." He reached into his duster and pulled out a worn leather pouch. He tossed it onto the counter. It landed with a soft thud, the weight of it seeming to fill the silence. "What's this?" she asked, her eyes narrowed. "Part of the reason I'm here," he said. Open it. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the pouch. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, the intensity of his presence. She took a deep breath and untied the leather thong, her hands trembling slightly. She opened the pouch and poured its contents onto the counter. Gold. A small pile of gold coins glittered in the lantern light, their surfaces worn smooth with age and handling. It wasn't a fortune, but it was more money than she'd seen in one place in a long time. Enough to make a difference. Enough to where did you get this? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't answer right away. He just watched her, his eyes shadowed. Does it matter?
Of course it matters, she snapped.
I won't take stolen money, Jessie. Not from you. Not from anyone. He gave a low chuckle, a sound devoid of humor. It's not stolen, Lori. Not exactly. Then what is it? He sighed, the sound heavy with weariness. It's payment. For a debt. A debt? To whom? He looked at her then, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own.
To you, Lori. To you.
The words hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. She stared at him, trying to make sense of what he was saying. A debt? To her? After all this time? I don't understand, she said, her voice shaking. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers, but he didn't quite touch her. The almost touch was more intimate, more unsettling, than if he had. I know it's hard to believe, he said, his voice softer now, almost gentle. But I never forgot you, Lori. Not for a single day. And I never forgot what I owed you. He paused, his gaze searching hers. I left because I had to, he continued, because I was involved in dangerous things. Things I couldn't drag you into. I thought I was protecting you. He gave a bitter laugh. Turns out I was just a damn fool. Protecting me? She echoed, the word laced with disbelief. By leaving me alone, with nothing? I know it doesn't make sense now, he said. But I swear to you, Lori, I did what I thought was best. At the time. He looked down at the gold coins, then back up at her. This is just a start, he said. There's more. Much more. I came back to make things right.
If you'll let me.
The storm outside had finally broken, rain lashing against the windows, the wind howling like a banshee. The sound mirrored the turmoil inside her. She didn't know what to believe. She didn't know what to feel. Part of her wanted to throw the gold back in his face, to tell him to get out and never come back. But another part, the part that had never stopped loving him, the part that had clung to the hope of his return for so long, wanted to believe him, wanted to forgive him. She looked at him, at the lines of hardship etched on his face, at the sadness in his eyes, and she saw a glimmer of the boy she'd once loved, the boy who had stolen her heart and ridden away with it. Could she trust him? Could she risk opening herself up to him again, knowing the pain he was capable of inflicting? The gold glittered on the counter, a tangible representation of his past and her future. He wanted to make amends. But could he really? And more importantly, could she? The rain intensified, each drop a question, a challenge, a hesitant maybe. Chapter 3. Scars of Yesterday. The silence that followed Jessie's declaration was punctuated only by the relentless drumming of rain against the roof and the occasional crackle of thunder that echoed across the plains. Lori stared at the gold, then back at Jessie, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Distrust warred with a desperate, aching hope she'd thought long dead. More? She finally asked, her voice rough with unshed tears. You said there's more? He nodded, his gaze unwavering. A lot more. Enough to give you a life you deserve. A life I should have given you 20 years ago. She scoffed, a bitter sound. A life I built myself, Jessie. Without you. I know, he said, his voice low and full of regret. And I'm not trying to take that away from you. I want to help. To make amends for the past. He reached out again, and this time, his fingers brushed against hers. The contact was brief, electric, sending a jolt through her that was both terrifying and exhilarating. She pulled her hand back as if burned. Don't, she said, her voice sharper than she intended. Don't touch me. He withdrew his hand, his expression unreadable. Lori, she interrupted, her voice rising. Tell me everything. Tell me where you've been, what you've done. Tell me why you left me, without a word. Tell me why you came back. He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for a difficult task. He leaned against the counter, his posture radiating a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. He looked older, harder, a man who had seen too much, done too much. It started with my father, he began, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the small space. He was a complicated man. A gambler, a drinker, a man who lived by his own rules. He got involved with the wrong people, owed money to men who didn't take kindly to unpaid debts. Lori remembered Jesse's father, a shadowy figure who had always seemed to carry an air of danger about him. She'd never liked him, never trusted him. He ran, Jesse continued, his voice flat and emotionless. Left me to deal with the mess. I was 18, green as grass, and suddenly I was facing down men who would have killed me without a second thought. He paused, his gaze drifting to the window, where the rain was still lashing against the glass. I did what I had to do to survive, he said. I made deals, I took risks, I rode with men who weren't always on the right side of the law. Lori felt a chill run down her spine. She'd always known there was a darkness in Jesse, a wildness that both attracted and frightened her. But she'd never imagined you became an outlaw, she said, the word a whisper, a condemnation. He didn't deny it. He just looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and shame. I did what I had to do, he repeated. I survived. And the money? She asked, gesturing to the gold coins on the counter. How did you get it? He hesitated, then shrugged. Some of it came from jobs we pulled. Banks, trains, stagecoaches. But most of it, he paused again, his gaze searching hers. Most of it came from protecting people. From righting wrongs. We weren't all bad, Lori. We had our own code. She stared at him, trying to reconcile the image of the boy she'd loved with the man standing before her, a man who had lived a life of violence and lawlessness. It was hard to swallow, hard to accept. And now? She asked. Why come back now? After all this time? He looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw, naked emotion that made her heart ache. Because I'm tired, Lori, he said. Tired of running, tired of fighting, tired of living in the shadows. I want a different life. A life with you. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken longing, with a hope that seemed almost too fragile to bear. She wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe him. But the scars of the past ran deep, the wounds he'd inflicted still raw and painful. I don't know if I can, Jesse, she said, her voice trembling. I don't know if I can trust you. Not after everything. He didn't try to argue. He just nodded, his expression accepting. I understand, he said. I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. I want a chance. A chance to prove myself. A chance to show you that I'm not the same man who rode away 20 years ago. He looked at her, his eyes pleading. Give me that chance, Lori. Please. The rain outside had begun to soften, the thunder fading into a distant rumble. The storm was passing, leaving behind a clean, washed world. But the storm inside her was still raging, a tempest of doubt, fear, and a lingering, undeniable love. She looked at Jesse, at the man who had broken her heart and now stood before her, offering her a chance at redemption, a chance at a future she'd thought long lost. Could she take that chance? Could she risk opening herself up to him again, knowing the pain he was capable of inflicting? The decision weighed on her, heavy as the gold on the counter, heavy as the years that had passed between them. She had to choose. And she had to choose now. Because whatever the future held, it was starting. Right here. Right now. Chapter 4. The Devil's Bargain. The air in the store, previously charged with tension, now held a fragile stillness, like the quiet breath before a plunge. Lori looked at Jesse, really looked at him, past the hardened exterior, the outlaw's swagger, to the flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. He was asking for trust, a commodity more precious than gold in this unforgiving land. And she was terrified to give it. A chance, she echoed, her voice barely a whisper. The word felt foreign on her tongue, a concept she'd long ago abandoned.
How?
He stepped closer, his presence a comforting warmth against the lingering chill of the storm. "Let me stay," he said, his voice low and earnest. "Let me work. Let me earn back your trust, day by day." She laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Work?
You?
What do you know about honest work, Jesse? You've spent your life living by the gun." He didn't flinch. "I know how to ride, how to shoot, how to survive," he said. "I can learn anything else you need me to do. I'm a fast learner, Lori. Always was." A memory flashed through her mind. Jesse, a young, cocky boy, teaching her how to shoot a rifle, his hand steadying hers, his breath warm on her cheek. She pushed the memory away, refusing to be swayed by nostalgia. "This town," she began, her voice hesitant. "They won't take kindly to an outlaw in their midst. Sheriff Thompson, he's a hard man. He won't hesitate to lock you up, or worse." Jesse's lips curved into a wry smile. "I've dealt with worse than Sheriff Thompson. And I'm not planning on causing any trouble. I just want a chance to start over." His words echoed her own desires, the longing for a fresh start, for a life free from the shadows of the past. But could she trust him to keep his word? Could she risk the safety of her town, her own hard-won peace, on the promise of a reformed outlaw? "There's a small ranch," she said slowly, her mind racing, "just outside of town. Belongs to old Mrs. Abernathy. She passed a few months back. It's been empty ever since. Needs work, a lot of work." She watched him carefully, gauging his reaction. The ranch was a wreck, a testament to years of neglect. It would be a hard, lonely life, a far cry from the excitement and danger he was used to. He didn't hesitate. "I'll take it," he said, his voice firm. "I'll work the ranch, make it profitable. I'll prove to you, to everyone, that I'm serious about this." She studied his face, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of the outlaw he'd once been. But all she saw was determination, a fierce resolve that both intrigued and frightened her. "And the money?" she asked, gesturing to the gold on the counter. "What about that?"
"It's yours," he said.
"Use it for the store, for the ranch, for whatever you need. It's a down payment on my debt to you. A promise of more to come." She hesitated, then reached out and scooped up the gold coins, their weight heavy in her hand. It was a tangible representation of his past, of the life he claimed he wanted to leave behind. It was also a risk, a gamble. "This is a devil's bargain, Jesse," she said, her voice low and serious. "You understand that? If you break your word, if you cause any trouble, I'll be the first one to turn you in to the sheriff." He met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. "I understand," he said. "And I won't break my word, Lori. I swear it. On everything I hold sacred." She didn't know what he held sacred anymore, what values he still possessed after years of living on the edge of the law. But she saw something in his eyes, a flicker of hope, a yearning for redemption that she couldn't ignore. "All right," she said, the word a sigh, a surrender. "You can have the ranch. But you'll answer to me, Jesse. You'll work hard, you'll stay out of trouble, and you'll earn your keep. And you'll earn back my trust, one day at a time." He nodded, a slow, solemn gesture. "Thank you, Lori," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You won't regret this." She hoped he was right. She prayed he was right. Because she'd just made a bargain with the devil, a gamble that could either save her or destroy her. And as she looked out at the clearing sky, at the faint glimmer of a rainbow arching across the horizon, she wondered if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life, or the first step towards a future she'd never dared to dream of. The only thing certain was that nothing would ever be quite the same again. A new chapter had begun, written in uncertainty and fueled by a dangerous hope. Chapter 5. Beneath a Sky of Secrets. The morning dawned crisp and clear, the air washed clean by the previous night's storm. The sun painted the eastern sky in hues of gold and rose, promising a day of warmth and light. But the beauty of the dawn did little to ease the knot of anxiety in Lori's stomach. She'd barely slept, her mind replaying the events of the previous evening, questioning her decision, her sanity. She found Jesse already at the Abernathy Ranch, his silhouette outlined against the rising sun. The place was even more dilapidated than she remembered. The fences were broken, the barn sagged precariously, and the house itself looked as if it might collapse at any moment. Weeds grew rampant in the yard, and the whole place had an air of abandonment and decay. He was working on the fence, his movements surprisingly efficient, his muscles rippling beneath his worn shirt. He'd shed his duster, revealing a physique that was leaner and harder than she remembered, honed by years of hard living. He worked with a quiet intensity, focused on the task at hand, as if he were trying to build not just a fence, but a new life. She watched him for a moment unnoticed, her heart aching with a mixture of longing and regret. He looked different, younger, somehow, despite the lines of hardship etched on his face. The outlaw swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet determination that was both intriguing and unsettling. He finally sensed her presence and turned, his eyes meeting hers across the dusty yard. He straightened up, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a smudge of dirt on his forehead. "Morning," he said, his voice a low rumble that sent a familiar shiver down her spine. "Morning," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. She walked towards him, her boots crunching on the gravel path. "You started early." He shrugged. "Lots to do." She surveyed the dilapidated ranch, her gaze lingering on the broken fences, the sagging barn, the neglected house. "It's a mess," she said, stating the obvious. "It'll be all right," he said, his voice confident. "Just needs some work." She looked at him, her eyes searching his. "You sure you're up to this, Jesse? It's not going to be easy." He met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. "I'm up to it, Lori. I promise you." She nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "I brought you some supplies," she said, gesturing to the wagon she'd driven up from town. "Food, tools, some bedding. Enough to get you started." He smiled then, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, transforming his face, making him look almost boyish. It was a smile that she hadn't seen in 20 years, a smile that had once made her heart melt. "Thank you, Lori," he said, his voice soft. "That's more than I expected." She shrugged, trying to appear unaffected by his smile, by his gratitude. "It's just business," she said, her voice brisk. "I want this ranch to be profitable. It's in my best interest to help you succeed." He didn't argue, but his smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of disappointment. She couldn't be sure. They spent the next few hours unloading the supplies, working side by side in a comfortable silence. It was a strange feeling, this partnership. She'd grown so used to being alone, to relying only on herself, that it felt both awkward and strangely comforting to have someone to share the burden. As they worked, she noticed the small details about him, the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. He was different, she realized. Harder, yes, but also gentler. More respectful. More aware of her. He caught her staring at one point, and she quickly looked away, embarrassed. He didn't say anything, but she saw a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "I also brought something else," she said, changing the subject. She reached into the wagon and pulled out a worn, leather-bound book. It was her father's journal, a record of his life, his struggles, his dreams. She'd kept it hidden away for years, unable to bear the pain of reading it. "What's that?" Jesse asked, his eyes curious. "It's my father's journal," she said. "I thought you might find it interesting. It talks about this land, about the history of this valley, about the people who lived here before us." He took the book from her, his fingers brushing against hers. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her. He held the book carefully, as if it were a precious artifact. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "I appreciate that." He opened the book, his gaze scanning the faded handwriting, the yellowed pages. She watched him, wondering what he was thinking, what he was feeling. He was a mystery to her, this man who had once been her lover, then a stranger, and now something in between. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the land, she realized that she was starting to see him, not as the outlaw who had broken her heart, but as a man trying to rebuild his life, a man seeking redemption. And beneath the vast, unforgiving sky, she began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he deserved a second chance. She glanced towards the horizon. A second chance, was that what she secretly wanted too? It was a dangerous thought, a frightening prospect. But she had to admit he intrigued her, and the mystery around him was part of the allure. She left him there, beneath the watchful eyes of the Maces. Chapter 6. The Price of Freedom. The following weeks settled into a rhythm, a slow, deliberate dance between Laurie and Jessie, between the past and the present, between hope and apprehension. He worked tirelessly on the ranch, his days filled with the sweat and toil of honest labor. He repaired fences, mended the barn, and even started to clear the overgrown fields, his determination fueled by a desire to prove himself, to earn back her trust. Laurie, in turn, found herself drawn to the ranch, to him, more and more often. She'd bring him supplies, offer advice, and sometimes just sit and watch him work, her presence a silent acknowledgement of his efforts. She found a quiet satisfaction in seeing the ranch slowly come back to life, in witnessing his transformation from a hardened outlaw to a man of the land. But the peace was fragile, threatened by the whispers and suspicions of the townsfolk. Redemption was a small town, and news traveled fast. The arrival of Jessie Hollister, the notorious outlaw, had sent ripples of unease through the community. People eyed him with suspicion, their conversations dying down whenever he entered the general store, their gazes following him as he walked down the street. Sheriff Thompson, a stern, unyielding man with a face like weathered granite, made his disapproval clear. He'd stopped by the ranch several times, his eyes narrowed, his hand hovering near his gun, questioning Jessie about his past, his intentions. He'd warned Laurie, too, his voice gruff and disapproving. "You're playing with fire, Laurie," he'd said, his gaze piercing. "That man is trouble. He'll bring nothing but heartache and pain to this town." She'd defended Jessie, her voice surprisingly strong, her conviction fueled by a growing belief in his sincerity. "He's trying to change, Sheriff," she'd said.
He deserves a chance.
But the sheriff remained unconvinced, his skepticism a constant reminder of the precariousness of their situation. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, Laurie found Jessie sitting on the porch of the ranch house, her father's journal open in his lap. He looked up as she approached, his face etched with a mixture of weariness and something else. Something she couldn't quite decipher. "How's it going?" she asked, her voice soft. He closed the journal, his fingers lingering on the worn leather cover. "It's hard," he admitted, his voice rough.
"Harder than I thought it would be."
She sat down beside him on the porch steps, the wood warm beneath her. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the chirping of crickets, the distant howl of a coyote. "The work?" she asked, finally breaking the silence. He shook his head. "Not just the work," he said. "The loneliness. The feeling of being an outsider. Of never truly belonging." She understood. She'd felt that way herself, for years after he'd left. The feeling of being alone, even in a crowd, of carrying a burden that no one else could understand. "It takes time, Jessie," she said, her voice gentle. "Time to heal, time to rebuild, time to earn people's trust." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw, naked emotion that made her heart ache. "And what about you, Laurie?" he asked. "Can you ever forgive me?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. She'd asked herself that same question countless times, and she still didn't have an answer. She'd forgiven him, in a way, intellectually. But emotionally there was still a wall, a barrier that she couldn't quite break down. "I'm trying, Jessie," she said, her voice honest. "I'm trying." He nodded, his expression accepting. He didn't push her, didn't demand more than she was ready to give. And that, in itself, was a sign of how much he'd changed. "Your father," he said, changing the subject. "He was a good man. A strong man." She looked at him, surprised. "You read his journal?" He nodded.
"Most of it," he said.
"He wrote about this land, about his love for it, about his dreams for it. He wrote about you, too." Her heart skipped a beat. "About me?" He smiled, a faint, wistful smile.
He was proud of you, Lori, he said.
He knew you were strong, resilient. He believed in you. Tears welled up in her eyes, tears of grief, of regret, of a longing for a father she'd lost too soon. She hadn't realized how much she'd needed to hear those words, to know that her father had understood her, had believed in her, even when she hadn't believed in herself. Jesse reached out and took her hand, his touch gentle, comforting. It was the first time he'd initiated physical contact since that first night, and she didn't pull away. His hand was warm and calloused, the hand of a working man, a man who had known hardship and struggle. He would have wanted you to be happy, Lori, he said, his voice soft. He would have wanted you to find peace. She looked at him, her eyes searching his. Could she find peace with him? Could she build a new life with this man who had once broken her heart? It was a risk, a gamble. But as she sat there, beneath the vast, star-studded sky, holding his hand, she realized that she was willing to take that risk. The price of freedom, she knew, was often high, but the reward could be immeasurable. She knew what she risked, but she also knew that to truly live, she needed to embrace the unknown, even if it was with him. Chapter 7. Where Shadows Dance. The annual Redemption Harvest Dance was a tradition as old as the town itself, a celebration of the year's bounty, a time for neighbors to come together, to share food, laughter, and a brief respite from the hardships of frontier life. Lori had always attended, even during the years when her heart felt as barren as the winter fields. It was a duty, a responsibility, a way of maintaining her connection to the community. But this year, the dance held a different significance. It was a test, a public declaration of her alliance with Jesse. She knew that bringing him would be a challenge, a provocation, a defiance of the town's unspoken disapproval. But she was determined. She wouldn't hide him away, wouldn't pretend that he didn't exist. He was a part of her life now, for better or worse, and she would face the consequences, whatever they may be. She'd found a dress tucked away in a trunk, a relic from her younger days, a pale blue silk that shimmered in the lamplight. It was a dress she'd worn when she was courting Jesse, a dress that held memories of laughter, of whispered promises, of a love that had once seemed invincible. It felt symbolic, somehow, to wear it again, as if she were reclaiming a part of herself that she'd thought lost forever. When she arrived at the ranch, Jesse was waiting for her, dressed in a clean shirt and trousers, his hair still damp from washing. He looked different. Not quite the outlaw, not quite the rancher, but something in between. A man caught between two worlds, trying to find his place. He stared at her, his eyes wide with surprise, with admiration. "You look," he began, his voice faltering. "Beautiful, Lori. You always did." She felt a blush rise to her cheeks, a warmth that had nothing to do with the desert heat. "Thank you," she said, her voice slightly breathless. "You clean up pretty well yourself." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "I'm trying," he said. "Trying to be respectable." She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "You're succeeding," she said. The ride into town was silent, filled with a nervous anticipation. As they approached the town hall, the sounds of music and laughter spilled out into the night, a beacon of light and warmth in the darkness. Lori could feel the tension in Jesse's body, the way he sat stiffly in the saddle, his eyes scanning the crowd. They dismounted and tied their horses to the hitching post, their movements attracting the attention of the other townsfolk. Conversations died down, heads turned, eyes followed them as they walked towards the entrance. Lori could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken questions, the judgment. She took Jesse's arm, her grip tight, a silent show of support. "Just be yourself," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the music. He nodded, his jaw set, his eyes determined. Inside the hall, the air was thick with the scent of food, perfume, and sweat. The room was decorated with colorful bunting, lanterns casting a warm, flickering glow on the dancers. A makeshift band played a lively tune, their music filling the space with a joyous energy. But as Lori and Jesse stepped into the room, the music seemed to falter. the laughter died down, and a hush fell over the crowd. All eyes were on them, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval to outright hostility. Sheriff Thompson, standing near the punch bowl, his face like thunder, watched them with narrowed eyes. Old Man Hemmings, sitting in a corner with a group of his cronies, muttered something under his breath, his words lost in the sudden silence. Laurie felt her heart pounding in her chest, her palms sweating. She wanted to turn and run, to escape the scrutiny, the judgment. But she stood her ground, her head held high, her grip on Jesse's arm tightening. Then, a voice broke the silence. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," Martha, the baker's wife, said, her voice surprisingly friendly. She walked towards them, a smile on her face, her ample bosom jiggling with each step. "Laurie, you look lovely. And Jesse, it's good to see you." She extended her hand to Jesse, a gesture of acceptance, of welcome. He took it, his expression surprised, grateful. "Thank you, Martha," he said, his voice sincere. Martha's gesture broke the ice, the tension in the room easing slightly. Others followed her lead, offering tentative greetings, curious glances. The music started up again, the dancers returning to the floor, the conversations resuming, albeit with a new undercurrent of gossip and speculation. Jesse looked at Laurie, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and pride. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice close to her ear. "For standing by me." She smiled, her heart swelling with a warmth that had nothing to do with the crowded room. "I told you," she said. "We're in this together." They danced then, a slow, hesitant waltz, their bodies close, their movements tentative at first, then gaining confidence. They danced beneath the watchful eyes of the townsfolk, beneath the flickering lanterns, beneath a sky of secrets and unspoken desires. And as they danced, Laurie realized that she was falling in love with him all over again, a love tempered by pain, by loss, but also by a newfound understanding, a deeper appreciation. This dance was a turning point. The shadows were still there, but, for the first time in a long time, Laurie felt as though they were starting to recede, pushed back by the growing light of a possible future. The dance would become a precious memory of hope. Chapter 8. A Renegade's Heart. The days following the harvest dance marked a subtle shift in the town's perception of Jesse. While suspicion still lingered, the overt hostility had lessened, replaced by a cautious curiosity. He continued to work tirelessly on the ranch, his efforts visible to anyone who passed by. The fences were mended, the barn repaired, and the field slowly began to yield to the plow. He was proving himself, not just to Laurie but to the entire community. One afternoon, Laurie found Jesse by the creek that ran through the Abernathy property, a place she remembered from her childhood, a haven of cool shade and whispering willows. He was sitting on a rock, his back to her, his shoulders slumped, his head in his hands. He looked defeated. She approached him quietly, her footsteps muffled by the soft earth. "Jesse?" she said, her voice gentle. He startled, turning to face her, his eyes red-rimmed, his expression filled with a pain she hadn't seen since he'd first ridden back into town. "What's wrong?" she asked, her heart constricting with concern. He shook his head, his voice rough. "It's nothing," he said. "Just tired." She didn't believe him. She sat down beside him on the rock, the cool water rushing past their feet. "Tell me," she said, her voice insistent. He hesitated, then sighed, the sound heavy with weariness. "I rode into town this morning," he said.
To get some supplies.
"I ran into some old acquaintances." Her heart sank. She knew what that meant. His past, the life he was trying to escape, was catching up to him. "Who?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and regret. "Men I used to ride with," he said. They want me to join them again. They have a job planned. A big one." She felt a chill run down her spine. She'd known this was a possibility, a risk she'd taken when she'd agreed to let him stay. But hearing it, facing the reality of it, was terrifying. "What did you tell them?" she asked, her voice trembling. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the rushing water. "I told them I wasn't interested," he said. "I told them I was done with that life."
And?
She prompted, her heart pounding in her chest. He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a fierce determination.
And they didn't believe me, he said.
They think I'm lying. They think I'm betraying them. She understood the danger. Outlaws didn't take kindly to betrayal. They had their own code, their own twisted sense of loyalty. And they wouldn't hesitate to punish anyone who crossed them. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice filled with fear. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers.
I don't know, he said. I don't want to run, Lori.
I'm tired of running, but I don't want to fight them either. I don't want to become that man again. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. His hand was warm and calloused, a comforting presence in the midst of her fear. You're not that man anymore, Jesse, she said, her voice firm. You've changed. You've proven that. He squeezed her hand, his grip tight.
But they don't see that, he said. They only see the outlaw.
The renegade. She looked at him, her heart aching for him, for the struggle he was facing. She knew what it was like to be trapped by the past, to be judged for mistakes you'd made, to be denied a chance at redemption. We'll figure something out, she said, her voice determined. We'll face this together. Just like we faced the dance. Just like we always will from now on. He smiled, a faint, grateful smile. You always were stubborn, he said, his voice soft. And you always were reckless, she replied, her voice teasing. They sat there for a long time, holding hands, listening to the soothing sounds of the creek, drawing strength from each other's presence. The future was uncertain, the danger real, but in that moment, surrounded by the beauty of the natural world, they found a measure of peace, a glimmer of hope. They were two souls, scarred by the past, bound together by a shared desire for a better future. A future they would fight for, together. No matter the cost. The renegade's heart, she realized, was also capable of profound loyalty. And it was that loyalty, that flicker of goodness, that gave her the strength to keep believing. Chapter 9. The Unforgiven. The threat hanging over Jesse manifested sooner than expected. 2 days after his encounter with his former gang members, they rode onto the Abernathy ranch, their horses kicking up dust, their faces grim, their intentions clear. Lori was in the barn, helping Jesse with a recalcitrant calf, when she heard the sound of approaching riders. Her heart leaped into her throat. She knew, instinctively, who it was. Jesse, she said, her voice urgent. They're here. He straightened up, his eyes narrowed, his hand instinctively moving towards the rifle leaning against the barn wall. He'd started carrying it again, a precaution he'd hoped he would need. Stay here, he said, his voice low and commanding. Don't come out, no matter what you hear. She wanted to argue, to insist on staying by his side, but she knew he was right. She wouldn't be any help in a gunfight. She'd only be a liability. Be careful, she whispered, her voice trembling. He nodded, his expression grim. He checked the load on his rifle, then stepped out of the barn, into the harsh sunlight. Lori watched from the shadows of the barn, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands clenched into fists. She could see 3 riders, their faces familiar from Jesse's descriptions. They were hard men, weathered by the sun and wind, their eyes cold and unforgiving. The leader, a burly man with a scarred face and a cruel smile, was the one Jesse had called Razor. Hollister, Razor called out, his voice harsh and grating. We need to talk. Jesse stood his ground, his rifle held loosely at his side, his posture radiating a calm defiance that belied the tension in his body. I told you, Jesse said, his voice clear and steady. I'm out. Razor chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. You don't just out, Hollister, he said. You know that. You're one of us. You're bound by blood. I made a choice, Jesse said. I'm choosing a different life. A life of mucking out stalls and chasing cows? Razor sneered. You think that's worthy of a man like you? A man like us? It's an honest life, Jesse said. It's a life I want. Razor spat on the ground, his eyes filled with contempt. You're a fool, Hollister, he said. You're turning your back on your brothers. On your family. My family is here, Jesse said, his gaze flicking towards the barn, towards Lori. It was a subtle movement, but Razor caught it. His eyes narrowed, his smile turning even crueler.
"The woman," he said.
"She's the reason, isn't she?
"She softened you. Made you weak."
Lori felt a surge of anger, a fierce protectiveness towards Jesse. She wanted to rush out of the barn, to confront Razor, to defend him. But she forced herself to stay put, knowing that any interference would only make things worse. "She has nothing to do with this," Jesse said, his voice tight with anger.
"She has everything to do with this," Razor said. "She's a distraction.
A liability. She's holding you back." He dismounted his horse, his movements slow and deliberate, his hand hovering near his gun. The other two riders followed suit, their eyes fixed on Jesse, their postures radiating menace. "We're giving you one last chance, Hollister," Razor said. "Join us. Ride with us." Or, he didn't finish the sentence. The threat was clear. Jesse stood his ground, his rifle still at his side, his eyes unwavering. He was outnumbered, outgunned, but he didn't show any fear. He was a cornered animal, ready to fight to the death. Lori watched, her heart in her throat, her breath caught in her chest. She couldn't bear to see him hurt, to see him killed.
She had to do something.
Anything. She looked around the barn, her eyes searching for a weapon, a tool, anything she could use to help him. Her gaze fell on an old pitchfork, leaning against the wall. It was a flimsy weapon, a desperate measure, but it was all she had. She gripped the pitchfork, her hands trembling, her heart pounding. She knew it was foolish, reckless, but she couldn't stand by and watch him die.
She had to try.
Just as Razor reached for his gun, Lori burst out of the barn, screaming, the pitchfork held high. It was a scene that would forever be etched in her memory. A scene of defiance, of love, of a desperate gamble. The confrontation had begun, and she was in the middle of it, a woman armed with nothing but a farm tool and a fierce determination to protect the man she loved. Chapter 10. Trails of Tears. Lori's sudden appearance, a whirlwind of fury and desperation, momentarily stunned the outlaws. Razor, his hand halfway to his gun, froze, his eyes wide with surprise. Jesse, his face a mask of shock and fear, shouted her name, his voice filled with a desperate urgency. "Lori."
"No."
"Get back inside." But she ignored him, her focus solely on Razor, her eyes blazing with a defiance that belied her terror. She charged towards him, the pitchfork held like a spear, a primal scream tearing from her throat. Razor, recovering from his initial surprise, sidestepped her clumsy attack with ease, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He grabbed the pitchfork, wrenching it from her grasp, tossing it aside like a discarded toy. "You're a feisty one, ain't ya?" He sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. Just like Hollister said. He grabbed her arm, his grip like a vice, his fingers digging into her flesh. She cried out in pain, struggling against him, but he was too strong. Jesse, seeing Lori in danger, reacted instantly. He raised his rifle, aiming at Razor, his finger tightening on the trigger. But he hesitated. He couldn't risk hitting Lori. "Let her go, Razor," he said, his voice low and dangerous, a deadly calm replacing his earlier fear. "This is between you and me." Razor laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You think I'm afraid of you, Hollister?" he said. "You've gone soft. You've lost your edge." He tightened his grip on Lori's arm, twisting it behind her back, forcing her to her knees. She gasped in pain, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'll kill her, Hollister," Razor said, his voice cold and menacing. "I'll kill her right here, right now, unless you drop your gun and come with us." Jesse's face was a mask of anguish, his eyes torn between his desire to protect Lori and his refusal to rejoin his former gang. He was trapped, caught in a devil's bargain with no good outcome. He lowered his rifle, slowly, reluctantly, his eyes never leaving Razor's. "All right," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'll go with you. Just let her go." Razor smiled, a triumphant, cruel smile. "Smart man, Hollister," he said. "You always were a survivor." He released Lori, shoving her towards Jessie, his eyes filled with contempt. She stumbled, falling into Jessie's arms, her body trembling with pain and fear. "Jessie, no," she whispered, her voice choked with sobs. "Don't go with them." Please. He held her close, his arms wrapping around her, his cheek resting against her hair. "It'll be all right, Lori," he said, his voice soft, reassuring. "I'll be back. I promise." But she knew it was a lie, a desperate attempt to comfort her, to ease her fear. She knew the dangers he faced, the ruthlessness of his former companions. She might never see him again. The other two outlaws, their faces impassive, watched the scene unfold, their hands still hovering near their guns. They were ready to intervene, to kill, if necessary. Razor mounted his horse, his eyes fixed on Jessie. "Let's go, Hollister," he said. "We've got a job to do." Jessie looked at Lori, his eyes filled with a love, a regret, a sorrow that tore at her heart. He leaned down and kissed her, a brief, desperate kiss that tasted of tears and unspoken promises. Then, he turned and walked towards the outlaws, his shoulders slumped, his head bowed. He was a prisoner, a captive, a man walking towards his doom. Lori watched him go, her body numb with shock, her heart shattered into a million pieces. She wanted to scream, to run after him, to beg him to stay. But she was frozen, paralyzed by grief, by despair. As the outlaws rode away, Jessie looked back, his eyes meeting hers one last time. He mouthed a single word: "Wait." Then, they were gone, swallowed up by the dust, leaving Lori alone in the vast, empty landscape, her heart filled with a pain so profound, so overwhelming, that she thought she might die. The tears flowed then, hot and bitter, trails of sorrow tracing paths down her dust-streaked cheeks. She sank to her knees, the weight of her loss crushing her, the silence of the ranch amplifying her despair. The promise of a future, so recently within reach, had vanished like a mirage in the desert heat. All that remained was the dust, the silence, and the agonizing echo of a love lost, perhaps forever. She didn't know how long she stayed like this. Chapter 11. Whispers of Redemption. The days that followed Jessie's departure were a blur of grief, anxiety, and a gnawing sense of helplessness. Lori moved through her life like a ghost, performing her daily tasks mechanically, her mind consumed by worry, by fear, by a desperate hope that he would somehow return. She haunted the ranch, walking the trails they'd walked together, touching the things he'd touched, clinging to the remnants of his presence. The townsfolk, initially sympathetic, grew increasingly uneasy. Jessie's abduction confirmed their worst fears about him, reinforcing their belief that he was, and always would be, an outlaw. Sheriff Thompson, his face grim, his voice laced with "I told you so," offered his condolences, but also a warning. "He's gone back to his old ways, Lori," he said. "You need to accept that. You need to move on." But she refused. She wouldn't give up on him. She couldn't. She knew, deep in her heart, that he hadn't gone willingly, that he was a prisoner, a victim of his past. She clung to his last word, "Wait," as if it were a lifeline, a promise she intended to keep. She spent hours poring over her father's journal, searching for clues, for any hint of Jessie's possible destination, of the big job Razor had mentioned. She knew the territory, the hidden canyons, the secret trails, the places where outlaws often hid. But the journal offered no concrete answers, only fragments of history, of stories of lost gold, of forgotten battles, of a land steeped in violence and lawlessness. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch, she found a small, folded piece of paper tucked inside the journal, a note she hadn't noticed before. It was written in Jessie's handwriting, a hurried scrawl that she recognized instantly. "Lori, if you're reading this, it means something's gone wrong. Razor and his gang, they're planning to rob the stagecoach, carrying the gold shipment from the Black Ridge mine. It's a suicide mission. They're outnumbered, outgunned. I tried to talk them out of it, but they wouldn't listen. The ambush is planned for Eagle Pass. It's a narrow canyon, a death trap. If you can, Warn the sheriff. Maybe there's still a chance to stop them. To save them. I love you, Lori. Always have, always will. Jessie. Her heart pounded in her chest, her hands trembling as she read the note. Eagle Pass. She knew the place. A treacherous canyon, notorious for its ambushes, its history of violence. It was a place of death, of lost hopes. She knew what she had to do. She had to warn the sheriff. She had to try to save Jessie, even if it meant risking her own life. She saddled her horse, her movements quick and decisive, her mind focused on the task at hand. She rode through the night, the moon her only guide, the wind whispering in her ears, carrying the echoes of Jessie's love, of his desperate plea. She reached redemption just as dawn was breaking, her horse exhausted, her body aching, her spirit fueled by a desperate hope. She found Sheriff Thompson at the jail, his face etched with surprise as he saw her, her disheveled appearance, her frantic expression. Lori, what's wrong? He asked, his voice concerned. She thrust the note into his hands, her voice breathless. Jessie, she said. He's in trouble. They're planning to rob the stagecoach at Eagle Pass. The sheriff read the note, his eyes narrowing, his face hardening. He looked at Lori, his expression a mixture of disbelief and respect. You believe this? He asked, his voice skeptical. I know it's true, she said, her voice firm. He wouldn't lie to me. Not about this. The sheriff hesitated, then nodded, his decision made. All right, he said. I'll gather a posse. We'll ride for Eagle Pass. He turned to his deputy, a young, eager man named Billy. Round up the men, he said. Tell them we're riding. And tell them to be ready for a fight. Lori watched as the sheriff and his posse prepared to ride, their movements swift and efficient, their faces grim, their determination clear. She wanted to go with them, to be there when they confronted Razor and his gang, to see Jessie, to make sure he was safe. But the sheriff refused. It's too dangerous, Lori, he said. You'll stay here. You've done enough. She argued, pleaded, but he was adamant. She was a civilian, a woman, and she would only be a hindrance in a gunfight. She watched them ride away, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and dread. She prayed they would be in time. She prayed Jessie would be safe. She prayed for a miracle. All she could do now was wait, and hope, and pray. The whispers of redemption, she realized, were often faint, fragile, easily drowned out by the roar of violence. But they were there, and she would cling to them with all her strength. It was the uncertainty that gnawed at her. Chapter 12. The Heart's Reckoning. The wait was agonizing. Hours stretched into an eternity, each tick of the clock a hammer blow against Lori's frayed nerves. She paced the floor of the sheriff's office, her mind replaying every possible scenario, each one more terrifying than the last. She imagined Jessie, caught in the crossfire, wounded, captured, or worse. She tried to distract herself, to focus on anything other than her fear. She cleaned the office, straightened the papers on the sheriff's desk, brewed a pot of coffee that she couldn't bring herself to drink. But nothing worked. Her mind was a prisoner of her anxiety, her heart a captive of her love for Jessie. Finally, as the sun began to set, casting long, ominous shadows across the town, she heard the sound of approaching riders. Her heart leaped into her throat, her breath catching in her chest. She rushed to the window, her eyes straining to see through the gathering dusk. It was the sheriff's posse, returning from Eagle Pass. But their faces were grim, their postures dejected, their movements slow and weary. And Jessie was not with them. Lori's heart sank. She felt a cold wave of despair wash over her, threatening to drown her in grief. She stumbled out of the office, into the street, her legs barely able to support her. Sheriff Thompson dismounted his horse, his face etched with a mixture of sorrow and resignation. He walked towards Lori, his boots crunching on the dusty ground, his eyes avoiding hers. Lori, he began, his voice heavy with unspoken words. She couldn't bear to hear it. She didn't want to know. She already knew. He's gone, isn't he? She said, her voice a whisper, a broken sob. The sheriff hesitated, then nodded, his gaze finally meeting hers.
"I'm sorry, Lori," he said.
"We were too late. The ambush, it was a massacre." She felt the world tilt beneath her, the ground swaying, the sky spinning. She wanted to scream, to cry, to rage against the unfairness of it all. But she was numb, paralyzed by grief, by the crushing weight of her loss. "We found bodies," the sheriff continued, his voice faltering. "Razor and his gang, they were all killed. We found Jesse's horse, but we didn't find him." A flicker of hope, faint and fragile, ignited within her. He wasn't dead. They hadn't found his body. He might still be alive. "He's alive," she said, her voice surprisingly strong, her conviction fueled by a desperate need to believe. "He has to be." The sheriff looked at her, his eyes filled with pity, with a sadness that mirrored her own. "Lori," he said gently, "the chances they're slim. Eagle Pass is a dangerous place. There are cliffs, canyons, wild animals. It's unlikely he could have survived." But she refused to accept that. She wouldn't give up hope. Not yet. "I'm going to find him," she said, her voice determined, her eyes blazing with a fierce resolve. "I'm going to search for him. I won't rest until I know what happened to him." The sheriff looked at her, his expression a mixture of admiration and concern. He knew she was grieving, that she was desperate, that she was grasping at straws. But he also saw her strength, her resilience, her unwavering love for Jesse. "All right, Lori," he said, "I'll help you. We'll organize a search party. We'll comb Eagle Pass. We'll do everything we can." She nodded, her heart filled with a gratitude that was tinged with despair. She knew the odds were against her, but she had to try. She had to keep searching. For Jesse. For herself. For the future they had both dreamed of, a future that might still be within reach, however faint the possibility. As the town gathered around her, offering their support, their condolences, their help, she realized that she wasn't alone. She had a community, a family of sorts who cared about her, who would stand by her, even in the face of tragedy. And as she looked out at the vast, starlit sky, at the distant peaks of Eagle Pass, she made a silent vow. She would find Jesse. She would bring him home. Or she would die trying. The heart's reckoning, she knew, was often painful, brutal. But it was also a testament to the enduring power of love, of hope, of the human spirit. And she would not be defeated. She would keep fighting. For him. For them. The search was about to begin. And this time, she will not rest until she finds what she seeks. Chapter 13. Between Law and Loyalty. The search for Jesse began at first light, a somber procession of townsfolk, led by Sheriff Thompson and Lori, their faces grim, their hearts heavy with a mixture of hope and dread. They rode towards Eagle Pass, the scene of the ambush, the place where Jesse had vanished, leaving behind only questions and a lingering sense of unease. The canyon was a desolate, forbidding place, its steep walls casting long, ominous shadows, its silence broken only by the cry of a hawk circling overhead. The air was thick with the scent of death, of gunpowder, of the lingering aftermath of violence. The remnants of the ambush were still visible: shattered wagons, scattered supplies, the bodies of horses, and the graves of the outlaws. Lori felt a chill run down her spine as she surveyed the scene, her eyes searching for any sign of Jesse, any clue to his fate. She walked among the graves, reading the hastily scrawled names on the makeshift crosses, her heart aching for the lives lost, for the violence that had stained this land. Sheriff Thompson, his face etched with sorrow, approached her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "We've searched the area, Lori," he said. "There's no sign of him. No tracks, no blood, nothing." She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She'd expected this, but hearing it, facing the reality of it, was still devastating. "He could have escaped," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He could have made it out of the canyon." The sheriff hesitated, then nodded. "It's possible," he said, "but unlikely. There are cliffs, ravines, wild animals. It's a dangerous place." They continued to search, combing the canyon, calling out Jesse's name, their voices echoing off the steep walls, their hopes dwindling with each passing hour. They found nothing. No sign of life, no sign of death, only the silence, the emptiness, the lingering ghost of a battle fought and lost. As the day wore on, the search party began to lose heart. The townsfolk, their initial enthusiasm waning, their faces reflecting their growing despair, started to talk of returning to redemption. Sheriff Thompson, his face grim, his voice weary, approached Lori. "We've done all we can, Lori," he said. "It's time to go back." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a fierce determination that belied her exhaustion. "No," she said. "I'm not giving up. I'm going to keep searching. I'll stay here if I have to." The sheriff sighed, his expression a mixture of admiration and frustration. He knew he couldn't force her to leave. He knew she wouldn't give up until she had an answer, until she knew what had happened to Jesse. He was a lawman, bound by duty, but also moved by human feelings. "All right, Lori," he said. "I'll stay with you. We'll search for a few more hours. But then we have to go back. We can't risk staying out here after dark." She nodded, her heart filled with a gratitude that was tinged with despair. She knew he was right, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Jesse was still out there, somewhere, waiting for her. They continued to search, their movements slow and deliberate, their eyes scanning every inch of the canyon floor, every crevice, every shadow. They found nothing. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the canyon, Lori felt a wave of despair wash over her. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. She was starting to lose hope. Then she saw it. A faint glimmer of metal, reflecting the last rays of the setting sun. It was a small object, half buried in the dirt, almost invisible. She rushed towards it, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She knelt down, her fingers trembling as she brushed away the dirt, revealing the object. It was a pocket watch. A silver pocket watch, engraved with the initials JH. She recognized it instantly. It was Jesse's watch. The one he always carried, the one he'd inherited from his grandfather. She clutched the watch to her chest, her eyes filling with tears. It was a sign. A clue. He'd been here. He'd survived the ambush. She looked up at Sheriff Thompson, her face filled with a renewed hope, a fierce determination. "He's alive," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "He's out there. We have to find him." The sheriff looked at the watch, his eyes widening with surprise. He knew what it meant. It was a sign of hope, a reason to keep searching. He was torn between the law, the rules, the practicalities, and the hope blazing in Lori's eyes. "All right, Lori," he said, his voice firm. "We'll keep searching. We'll find him." The line between law and loyalty had blurred, replaced by a shared determination to find a man who had, against all odds, become a symbol of redemption, of a second chance. And as the last rays of sunlight faded, they renewed their search, their hearts fueled by a flicker of hope, a belief in the impossible. This was not just about the law anymore. Chapter 14. A Storm of Truth. The discovery of Jesse's watch reignited the search, injecting a renewed sense of purpose into the weary group. Sheriff Thompson, despite his initial reservations, was now fully committed, his lawman's instincts merging with a growing respect for Lori's unwavering determination. They scoured the area around where the watch was found, looking for any other sign, any clue that might lead them to Jesse. As darkness fell, they built a fire, its flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the canyon walls, a beacon of hope in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. They ate a meager meal of cold rations, their conversation hushed, their thoughts focused on the man they were searching for. Lori couldn't sleep. She sat by the fire, clutching Jesse's watch, her mind racing, her heart aching with a mixture of fear and hope. She imagined him, out there alone, injured, perhaps lost, his survival hanging by a thread. She remembered the stories he'd told her about his life as an outlaw, the dangers he'd faced, the close calls he'd survived. He was a resourceful man, a survivor, but even he had his limits. As the night wore on, the weather began to change. The wind picked up, howling through the canyon, carrying with it the scent of rain, of a coming storm. The fire flickered wildly, threatening to be extinguished by the gusts of wind. Sheriff Thompson, his face grim, his voice concerned, approached Lori. "We need to find shelter," he said. "This storm is going to be a bad one." She nodded, her eyes fixed on the swirling clouds, the flashes of lightning that illuminated the sky. She knew he was right. They couldn't stay out in the open. They found a small cave, a shallow indentation in the canyon wall, offering a meager protection from the elements. They huddled together, their bodies close, sharing their warmth, their fears, their hopes. The storm hit with a fury, the rain lashing down, the thunder echoing through the canyon, the lightning illuminating the landscape in brief, terrifying flashes. It was a storm of biblical proportions, a tempest that mirrored the turmoil in Lori's heart. As the storm raged, Lori noticed something. A faint sound, barely audible above the roar of the wind and rain. It was a whimper, a cry of pain. She strained her ears, listening intently, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. It was coming from outside the cave. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice urgent, her eyes wide with alarm. Sheriff Thompson, his face etched with concern, listened carefully.
"I don't hear anything," he said.
"Just the storm." But she was sure. She knew what she'd heard.
It was a human sound.
A cry for help. "It's Jesse," she said, her voice trembling with conviction. "I know it's him. He's out there. He's hurt." She stood up, her movements determined, her eyes blazing with a fierce resolve.
"I'm going to find him," she said.
The sheriff grabbed her arm, his grip tight.
"Lori, no," he said.
"It's too dangerous. You can't go out there in this storm. You'll get lost. You'll get killed." But she wouldn't be deterred. She pulled away from him, her eyes fixed on the entrance to the cave, her heart pounding in her chest.
"I have to," she said. "I have to try.
He's out there. He needs me." She stepped out of the cave, into the raging storm, the wind and rain lashing against her, the darkness engulfing her. She called out Jesse's name, her voice hoarse, her throat raw, her cries swallowed by the roar of the storm. She stumbled through the darkness, her feet slipping on the wet rocks, her body battered by the wind and rain. She didn't know where she was going. She had no plan. She was driven only by instinct, by love, by a desperate hope that she would find him. And then she saw it. A faint light, flickering in the distance. A small fire, sheltered beneath a rocky overhang. She ran towards it, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. As she drew closer, she saw him. Jesse. He was lying on the ground, his body huddled against the rock, his face pale and drawn, his clothes soaked and torn. He was injured, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle, his arm bleeding. She rushed to his side, kneeling beside him, her hands trembling as she touched his face. "Jesse," she cried, her voice choked with sobs. "Jesse, it's me. It's Lori." He opened his eyes, slowly, his gaze unfocused, his expression filled with pain and relief. "Lori?" he whispered, his voice weak, barely audible above the storm. "You came." She cradled his head in her lap, her tears mingling with the rain, her heart overflowing with a love so profound, so overwhelming, that it took her breath away. "I'm here, Jesse," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm here. I'm not leaving you." The storm of truth had revealed not only Jesse's location, but also the depth of Lori's unwavering love, a love that had weathered betrayal, hardship, and now a literal tempest. The night was far from over, but for the first time in days, a glimmer of hope shone through the darkness, brighter than any star. The reunion was bittersweet. Chapter 15. The Touch of Grace. The relief of finding Jesse was quickly overshadowed by the urgency of his condition. He was shivering uncontrollably, his skin cold and clammy, his breathing shallow and ragged. The wound on his arm was bleeding profusely, and his leg was clearly broken, the bone protruding at an unnatural angle. Lori, despite her lack of medical training, knew she had to act fast. She tore strips of cloth from her dress, using them to bandage his arm, applying pressure to stem the bleeding. She then used her scarf to splint his leg, improvising with branches she found near the overhang, trying to stabilize the fracture. She talked to him constantly, her voice soothing, reassuring, her words a lifeline in the darkness, a promise of hope.
"You're going to be all right, Jesse," she said.
"I'm here. I'm taking care of you.
Just hold on."
He drifted in and out of consciousness, his eyes flickering open and closed, his responses slurred and incoherent. He recognized her. She knew, but he was fading, his grip on life tenuous. She built up the fire, feeding it with dry branches she found under the overhang, trying to create warmth, to fight off the hypothermia that threatened to claim him. She huddled close to him, sharing her body heat, her arms wrapped around him, her presence a shield against the storm, against the encroaching darkness.
She prayed.
She prayed to a God she hadn't spoken to in years, a God she'd almost given up on. She prayed for strength, for guidance, for a miracle. As the night wore on, the storm began to subside, the wind dying down, the rain softening to a drizzle. The first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky in pale hues of gray and pink, promising a new day, a new beginning. Jesse's condition, however, remained precarious. He was still unconscious, his breathing shallow, his pulse weak. Lori knew she had to get him to a doctor, to safety, to civilization. She couldn't carry him. He was too heavy, too injured. She needed help. She remembered the sheriff, the search party, waiting for her back at the cave. She had to reach them. She had to bring them back to Jesse. She made a decision. She would leave Jesse, briefly, to get help. It was a risk, a gamble, but she had no choice. She kissed him on the forehead, her lips lingering on his cold skin. "I'll be back, Jesse," she whispered. "I promise.
Just hold on."
She left him sheltered beneath the overhang, the fire still burning, a beacon of hope in the vast, empty landscape. She ran, her legs aching, her lungs burning, her heart pounding with fear and determination. She found the cave, the sheriff and the remaining members of the search party huddled inside, their faces etched with worry, their eyes filled with a mixture of relief and surprise as they saw her. "Lori," Sheriff Thompson exclaimed, his voice filled with concern. "You're alive." "We thought she didn't let him finish." "I found him," she said, her voice breathless. "I found Jesse. He's alive. But he's hurt.
Badly.
We need to get him to a doctor." The sheriff, his face a mask of determination, nodded. "Show us the way," he said. They followed her, their movements swift and efficient, their hearts filled with a renewed sense of hope. They reached Jesse, their faces reflecting their shock and concern as they saw his condition. They fashioned a makeshift stretcher from branches and blankets, carefully lifting him onto it, their movements gentle, their touch filled with a newfound respect for the man they had once considered an outlaw. They carried him back to redemption, a slow, arduous journey, their steps heavy with fatigue, their spirits buoyed by the knowledge that they had saved a life. They brought him to the town doctor, a gruff, elderly man named Silas, who examined him with a practiced eye, his face grim, his words clipped. "He's lost a lot of blood," Silas said. "His leg is broken. He has a fever.
He's in a bad way."
But he didn't give up. He worked tirelessly, cleaning and stitching Jesse's wounds, setting his leg, administering what little medicine he had. Lori stayed by Jesse's side, watching, waiting, praying. She held his hand, her fingers intertwined with his, her touch a constant reassurance, a silent promise of love, of hope, of a future they might still share. As the hours passed, Jesse's condition slowly began to improve. His fever subsided, his breathing became more regular, his pulse stronger. He was still unconscious, but he was alive. He was fighting. And Lori knew, with a certainty that went beyond reason, beyond logic, that he would survive. He would recover. He would live. Because their love, their bond, was stronger than any storm, any injury, any obstacle. It was a love forged in fire, tempered by hardship, a love that had endured the trials of time, of betrayal, of loss. It was a love that had found its way back, a love that had been redeemed. The touch of grace, she realized, was not just about divine intervention. It was about human connection, about forgiveness, about the enduring power of love to heal, to transform, to conquer even the darkest of shadows. And she was grateful. Beyond words. Chapter 16. Beyond the horizon. The weeks that followed were a period of slow, painstaking recovery. Jesse, confined to a bed in Laurie's small house behind the general store, gradually regained his strength, his body mending, his spirit slowly healing. He was a difficult patient, restless, impatient, chafing at his confinement, eager to return to the life he'd almost lost. Laurie, in turn, was a tireless caregiver, tending to his needs, nursing him back to health, her love and devotion unwavering. She cooked for him, cleaned his wounds, read to him from her father's journal, sharing stories of the land, of the life they might build together. The townsfolk, initially wary, gradually warmed to Jesse, their suspicion replaced by a grudging respect, their hostility giving way to a tentative acceptance. They saw the change in him, the genuine remorse, the desire for redemption. They saw Laurie's unwavering faith in him, her love and devotion, and they began to believe. 2. Sheriff Thompson, a man of few words, visited Jesse regularly, his presence a silent acknowledgement of the transformation he had witnessed, a tacit acceptance of the man Jesse had become. He'd even offered Jesse a job, a chance to use his skills, his knowledge of the territory, to serve the community, to protect the innocent. It was an offer Jesse was considering, a path to redemption, a way to make amends for his past. But he was hesitant, unsure if he was worthy, if he could truly leave his old life behind. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, Laurie found Jesse sitting on the porch, his leg propped up on a stool, his gaze fixed on the distant mesas. He looked pensive, his face etched with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. She sat down beside him, her presence a comforting warmth against the evening chill. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the chirping of crickets, the distant howl of a coyote. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her voice soft. He turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "The future," he said, his voice low and thoughtful. "Our future." She smiled, a gentle, loving smile. "What about it?" He hesitated, then took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. His hand was warm and strong, a comforting presence in hers. "I've been thinking about the sheriff's offer," he said. "About becoming a deputy." She looked at him, her eyes filled with surprise, with hope. "And?" she prompted. He shrugged, his expression uncertain. "I don't know, Laurie," he said. "It's a big step. A different life. Can I really do it?" She squeezed his hand, her grip tight. "You can do anything you set your mind to, Jesse," she said. "You've proven that. You've come so far. You've changed." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a love, a gratitude, that made her heart ache. "You believe in me," he said, his voice a whisper. "Even when I didn't believe in myself." "I always have," she said, her voice firm. "And I always will." He smiled then, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, transforming his face, making him look almost boyish again. It was the smile that had stolen her heart 20 years ago, the smile that had sustained her through the years of loneliness, of loss, of waiting. "I love you, Laurie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "More than words can say." She leaned in and kissed him, a slow, tender kiss that spoke of love, of forgiveness, of a future filled with hope, with promise. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, their commitment to each other, their shared journey towards a new beginning. "I love you too, Jesse," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Always have, always will." They sat there, hand in hand, watching the sunset, the sky ablaze with color, a promise of a new day, a new life. They had traveled a long, arduous road, a journey filled with pain, with loss, with betrayal. But they had found their way back to each other, their love stronger, their bond deeper, their future brighter than ever before. They looked out at the horizon, at the vast, open landscape, at the endless possibilities that lay before them. They had a ranch to rebuild, a life to create, a community to serve. They had challenges to face, obstacles to overcome. But they would face them together, their love a guiding light, their courage a shield, their hope a beacon in the darkness. Beyond the horizon, a new life awaited them, a life filled with love, with purpose, with redemption. And they were ready. Together. They were finally ready to move forward. Chapter 17. A Promise Forged in Fire. The decision to accept Sheriff Thompson's offer wasn't made lightly. Jesse wrestled with it for days, torn between the desire for a fresh start and the lingering shadows of his past. He knew the risks, the challenges, the scrutiny he would face. But he also knew it was an opportunity, a chance to make amends, to prove himself worthy of Laurie's love, of the town's trust. He finally accepted, his decision solidified by a conversation with Laurie, a heart-to-heart talk that laid bare their fears, their hopes, their dreams for the future. They spoke of marriage, of children, of building a life together on the ranch, a life rooted in honesty, in love, in a shared commitment to the community. The news of Jesse's appointment as deputy was met with mixed reactions and redemption. Some were skeptical, their doubts lingering, their memories of his outlaw past still fresh. Others were cautiously optimistic, willing to give him a chance, their faith in Laurie's judgment overriding their reservations. Jesse, aware of the scrutiny he was under, threw himself into his new role with a dedication and a diligence that surprised even Sheriff Thompson. He learned the law, studied the procedures, practiced his marksmanship, honing his skills, his knowledge, his commitment to upholding justice. He patrolled the town, his presence a reassuring sight to some, a source of unease to others. He investigated crimes, solved disputes, protected the innocent, his actions speaking louder than words, his deeds gradually eroding the lingering distrust. He also continued to work on the ranch, his days divided between his duties as deputy and his responsibilities as a landowner. He rebuilt the fences, repaired the barn, planted crops, his efforts a testament to his commitment to a new life, a life of honest labor, of contributing to the community. Laurie, in turn, supported him every step of the way, her love and encouragement his constant source of strength. She ran the general store, providing for the town's needs, her presence a stabilizing force, her quiet strength a beacon of hope. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sunset, Jesse turned to Laurie, his eyes filled with a love, a gratitude, that made her heart swell. "I want to marry you, Laurie," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I want to make it official. I want to spend the rest of my life with you." She smiled, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "I want to marry you too, Jesse," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "More than anything." He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, his touch sending a shiver of warmth through her. He pulled out a small, velvet box, his movements slow and deliberate. He opened the box, revealing a ring. It wasn't a fancy ring, not a diamond or a jewel. It was a simple band of silver, engraved with a single word, always. It was the ring he'd given her 20 years ago, the ring he'd taken back when he'd left, the ring he'd kept all these years, a symbol of his enduring love, of his regret, of his hope for a second chance. Laurie gasped, her eyes widening with surprise, with disbelief. "Jesse," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You kept it all this time?" He nodded, his eyes filled with tears. "I never stopped loving you, Laurie," he said. "Not for a single day. This ring, it was a promise. A promise I intend to keep." He slipped the ring onto her finger, its fit perfect, as if it had always belonged there. It was a symbol of their enduring love, of their shared journey, of their commitment to a future together. They kissed, a long, passionate kiss that sealed their promise, their love, their future. It was a kiss forged in fire, tempered by hardship, a kiss that spoke of forgiveness, of redemption, of a love that had conquered all. They were married a few weeks later, in a simple ceremony held in the town square, surrounded by the people of redemption, their friends, their neighbors, their community. Sheriff Thompson officiated, his voice filled with a newfound respect for the man Jesse had become, his eyes reflecting the hope that had blossomed in the heart of the town. As they stood there, hand in hand, exchanging vows, Lori and Jesse knew that their journey was far from over. They had challenges to face, obstacles to overcome. But they would face them together, their love a guiding light, their courage a shield, their hope a beacon in the darkness. Their promise, forged in fire, tempered by hardship, was now a reality, a testament to the enduring power of love, of forgiveness, of second chances. And as they looked out at the faces of their friends, their neighbors, their community, they knew they were home. Finally. Truly. Home. Chapter 18. The Outlaw's Embrace. Married life settled into a comfortable rhythm, a blend of domesticity and the ever-present demands of the frontier. Lori continued to run the general store, her days filled with the bustle of commerce, the chatter of customers, the satisfaction of providing for her community. Jesse, in his role as deputy, patrolled the town and surrounding territory, his presence a reassuring sight, his dedication to upholding the law unwavering. The ranch, too, flourished under their combined efforts. The fields yielded a bountiful harvest, the livestock thrived, and the house itself, once dilapidated and neglected, slowly transformed into a home, filled with warmth, with laughter, with the echoes of their shared love. But the past, like a persistent shadow, occasionally reared its head, reminding them of the challenges they had overcome, of the scars they still carried. Old acquaintances of Jesse's, remnants of his outlaw days, sometimes rode through town, their presence a test of his loyalty, a reminder of the life he had left behind. One such encounter occurred during a particularly hot summer afternoon. Lori was in the store, helping a customer, when she saw a group of riders approach, their faces familiar, their postures radiating a menacing air. She recognized them instantly, members of Razor's old gang, men Jesse had once considered brothers. Her heart pounded in her chest, her hands trembling. She knew the danger, the potential for violence. She wanted to warn Jesse, to protect him, but he was out on patrol, miles away from town. The riders dismounted, their spurs jingling on the wooden sidewalk, their eyes scanning the street, their hands hovering near their guns. They entered the store, their presence filling the space, their shadows falling across the shelves, across Lori. Well, one of them said, his voice a sneer. Look what we have here. The outlaw's woman. Lori stood her ground, her chin lifted, her eyes meeting his with a defiance that belied her fear. What do you want? She asked, her voice surprisingly steady. We heard Hollister turned lawman, another one said, his voice laced with contempt. We came to see for ourselves. To see if it's true. It's true, Lori said. He's a changed man. He's left that life behind. They laughed, harsh, mocking laughs that echoed through the store. Once an outlaw, always an outlaw, the first one said. He'll be back. They always come back. He won't, Lori said, her voice firm. He's made his choice. He's chosen a different life. A life with me. They stepped closer, their bodies crowding her, their intentions clear. They were trying to intimidate her, to provoke her, to test her loyalty to Jesse. You think you can change him? One of them asked, his voice a whisper, his breath hot on her face. You think you can tame him? She didn't flinch. She met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. He's not a wild animal to be tamed, she said. He's a man. A good man. And he's mine. Just then, the door to the store swung open, and Jesse stepped inside, his silhouette framed against the bright sunlight. He'd returned from patrol, his timing providential. He saw the scene unfolding before him, his eyes narrowing, his hand instinctively moving towards his gun. He recognized the riders, his former companions, his one-time brothers. What's going on here? he asked, his voice low and dangerous, a deadly calm replacing his usual warmth. The riders turned, their faces reflecting a mixture of surprise and apprehension. They hadn't expected him to return so soon. "Hollister," one of them said, his voice a challenge. "We were just catching up with your woman." Jesse stepped forward, his body positioning itself between Laurie and the outlaws, his presence a shield, a protector. "Leave her alone," he said, his voice cold and hard. "She has nothing to do with this." "She has everything to do with this," another one said. "She's the reason you turned your back on us. She's made you weak." Jesse's eyes flashed with anger, but he kept his voice controlled.
"I made my choice," he said.
"I chose a different life. A life of law, of order, of peace." "There's no peace for men like us, Hollister," the first one said.
"You know that."
"You're one of us. You'll always be one of us." Jesse shook his head, his expression resolute. "I'm not one of you anymore," he said. "I'm a lawman, and I'm telling you to leave.
Now."
They hesitated, their eyes locked with Jesse's, a silent battle of wills, a test of loyalty, of commitment. They knew he was serious. They knew he wouldn't hesitate to use his gun, to defend his wife, his town, his new life. Finally, they backed down, their bravado crumbling, their confidence shattered. They turned and walked out of the store, their spurs jingling on the wooden sidewalk, their shadows receding into the bright sunlight. Jesse watched them go, his body tense, his hand still hovering near his gun. Then he turned to Laurie, his eyes filled with concern, with love. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft, his touch gentle. She nodded, her body trembling, her heart still pounding. "I'm fine," she said. "Thanks to you." He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, his embrace tight, reassuring. It was the outlaw's embrace, protective, possessive, but also tender, loving, filled with a depth of emotion that transcended his past, his former life. "I love you, Laurie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll always protect you. Always." She leaned into him, her body finding comfort in his strength, her heart finding solace in his love. "I love you too, Jesse," she said. "And I'll always stand by you. Always." The outlaw's embrace, once a symbol of danger, of lawlessness, had become a symbol of love, of protection, of a bond that could not be broken. It was a testament to their enduring love, their shared journey, their commitment to a future together, a future free from the shadows of the past. They had faced the darkness, and they had emerged stronger, their love a beacon of hope, a testament to the transformative power of redemption. The embrace was a promise kept. Chapter 19. The Weight of Honor. The incident with Jesse's former gang members served as a stark reminder of the ever-present tension between his past and his present. While he had embraced his new life as a lawman and a husband, the specter of his outlaw days continued to linger, a shadow that occasionally threatened to darken their hard-won peace. A few weeks later, a new challenge arose, one that tested Jesse's loyalty and his commitment to the law in a way he hadn't anticipated. A series of cattle rustlings had plagued the neighboring ranches, the thieves operating with a skill and a boldness that suggested they were experienced, organized, and possibly familiar with the territory. Sheriff Thompson, his face grim, his voice concerned, called Jesse into his office. "We need to stop these rustlers, Jesse," he said. "They're crippling the ranchers, threatening the livelihood of the entire community." Jesse nodded, his expression determined. "I'll do everything I can, Sheriff," he said. "I'll find them." He began his investigation, meticulously gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, tracking the rustlers' movements. He spent days in the saddle, riding across the vast, open landscape, his eyes scanning the horizon, his mind working tirelessly, piecing together the clues. He soon discovered a pattern, a familiar tactic, a strategy he recognized from his own outlaw days. The rustlers were using hidden trails, secret canyons, places known only to a select few, places he himself had used in the past. He realized, with a growing sense of dread, that the rustlers were likely men he had once ridden with, men who knew the territory as well as he did, men who were using his own knowledge against him. He was faced with a dilemma, a moral conflict that tore at his conscience. He was a lawman, sworn to uphold justice, to protect the innocent. But he also felt a lingering sense of loyalty to his former companions, a bond forged in shared hardship, in a life lived on the edge of the law. He confided in Lori, his voice heavy with uncertainty, his eyes filled with a pain she understood all too well. I think I know who the rustlers are," he said. "They're men I used to ride with." She listened patiently, her heart aching for him, for the burden he carried. She knew the weight of his past, the constant struggle between his old life and his new. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice soft, her touch gentle. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "I don't know, Lori," he said. "I don't want to betray them. But I can't let them continue to steal from our neighbors, from our community." She took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, her grip tight. "You have to do what's right, Jesse," she said. "You have to uphold the law. You have to protect the innocent." He nodded, his expression resolute. "I know," he said. "But it's not easy." He made a decision. He would confront the rustlers, but he would try to do it peacefully, to give them a chance to surrender, to avoid bloodshed. He rode out alone, following the trail, his heart heavy with a mixture of dread and determination. He found them in a hidden canyon, their camp nestled among the rocks, their stolen cattle grazing nearby. They were surprised to see him, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock and betrayal. They recognized him instantly, their former companion, their one-time brother. "Hollister," one of them said, his voice a challenge. "What are you doing here?" Jesse dismounted, his hand resting on his gun, but he didn't draw it. "I'm here to stop you," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here to ask you to surrender." They laughed, harsh, mocking laughs that echoed through the canyon. "You think we're afraid of you, Hollister?" Another one said. "You're just one man. We're outnumbered." "I know," Jesse said. "But I'm not alone. I have the law on my side, and I have something to fight for." He looked towards the entrance to the canyon, towards the horizon, towards the future he had built with Lori, towards the life he had chosen. He gave them one last chance. "Surrender," he said. "Lay down your weapons. Come back with me. Face justice. It's not too late to change. It's not too late to redeem yourselves." They hesitated, their eyes flickering between Jesse and their stolen cattle, between their outlaw past and the possibility of a different future. The weight of honor, of loyalty, of the choices they had made, hung heavy in the air. It was a moment of truth, a turning point, a decision that would determine their fate, and Jesse's. The tension was palpable, the silence deafening, the outcome uncertain. Jesse waited. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The silence stretched, taut and heavy, punctuated only by the nervous shuffling of the horses and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. The rustlers, Jesse's former comrades, exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado faltering, their confidence shaken by his unexpected appearance and his plea for surrender. Finally, the leader, a man named Bart, stepped forward, his face etched with a mixture of defiance and regret. He'd ridden with Jesse for years, shared hardships, faced dangers, forged a bond that was now being tested to its breaking point. "You've changed, Hollister," Bart said, his voice rough, his eyes searching Jesse's. "You've gone soft. You've forgotten what it means to be free." "I haven't forgotten anything, Bart," Jesse replied, his voice calm but firm. "I've just learned a different way. A better way." "There's no better way than the outlaw way," another rustler, a younger man named Slim, interjected, his voice laced with a youthful arrogance. "We live by our own rules. We take what we need." "And you hurt innocent people in the process," Jesse countered, his gaze unwavering. "You steal from your neighbors, from the people who are trying to build a life here, just like you." "They have more than they need," Bart said, his voice defensive. "We're just redistributing the wealth." Jesse shook his head, his expression filled with a mixture of sadness and disappointment. "That's not how it works, Bart," he said. "You can't build a life on stolen goods. You can't find peace through violence. You can't escape the consequences of your actions." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the wrestlers, his eyes lingering on Bart's. "I know you're not bad men," he said. "I know you've made mistakes. We all have. But it's not too late to change. It's not too late to make amends." He offered them one last chance. "Surrender," he said. "Lay down your weapons. Come back with me. Face justice. I'll speak for you. I'll vouch for you. I'll do everything I can to help you." The wrestlers hesitated, their eyes flickering between Jesse and their weapons, between their outlaw past and the uncertain future he was offering. Then, slowly, reluctantly, Bart nodded, his decision made. "All right, Hollister," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "We'll surrender. We'll take our chances with the law." The other wrestlers, following Bart's lead, laid down their weapons, their movements slow and deliberate, their faces reflecting a mixture of relief and apprehension. Jesse, his heart filled with a mixture of gratitude and sadness, collected their guns, his movements careful, his eyes watchful. He knew it was a victory, a triumph of law over lawlessness, of redemption over regret. But it was also a loss, a severing of ties, a final farewell to a past he could never fully escape. He led them back to redemption, a somber procession, the captured wrestlers riding alongside their former comrade, their captor, their friend. Sheriff Thompson, his face etched with surprise and relief, met them at the edge of town. "You did it, Jesse," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You brought them in. Peacefully." Jesse nodded, his expression weary but resolute. "They surrendered, Sheriff," he said. "They chose to face justice." The rustlers were taken into custody, their fate now in the hands of the law. Jesse, true to his word, spoke on their behalf, vouching for their character, pleading for leniency. He knew they would face punishment, but he hoped they would also be given a chance to rebuild their lives, to find redemption. As he watched them being led away, he felt a pang of sadness, a lingering sense of loss. But he also felt a sense of peace, a feeling of closure. He had done what was right. He had upheld the law. He had protected his community. He had honored his commitment to Lori, to his new life, to the future they were building together. He returned to the ranch, to Lori, his heart filled with a love that had endured the trials of time, of betrayal, of violence. She was waiting for him, her face etched with worry, her eyes searching his. "It's over," he said, his voice soft, his touch gentle. "They surrendered. They're in custody." She rushed into his arms, her body trembling with relief, her tears mingling with his. "Thank God," she whispered. "Thank God you're safe." They held each other close, their embrace a refuge, a sanctuary, a testament to their enduring love, their shared journey, their commitment to a future free from the shadows of the past. The final confrontation had not been a battle of guns, but a battle of hearts, a clash between loyalty and justice, between the past and the present. And in the end, love, forgiveness, and the hope for redemption had triumphed. The horizon, once clouded by uncertainty, now stretched before them, clear and bright, a promise of a new beginning, a life built on honesty, on trust, on the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome even the darkest of shadows. They had made it. Together they will walk to a new beginning. Epilogue. Years passed, marked by the changing seasons, the rhythm of ranch life, and the steady growth of redemption into a thriving frontier town. Jesse, no longer the outlaw, but a respected member of the community, served as deputy for many years, his wisdom and experience guiding him, his commitment to justice unwavering. He eventually became sheriff, succeeding Thompson upon his retirement, his past a reminder of the transformative power of redemption, his present a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. Lori remained his constant companion, his partner in life and love, her strength and resilience, his unwavering support. The general store flourished, becoming a hub of activity, a gathering place for the townsfolk, a symbol of the community's growth and prosperity. They never had children of their own, but they became surrogate parents to many, their home a haven for orphan children, for young couples starting out, for anyone in need of a helping hand, a kind word, a warm embrace. They shared their love, their wisdom, their experience, their home becoming a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of family, both blood and chosen. The ranch, too, thrived, the fields yielding bountiful harvests, the livestock multiplying, the land itself seeming to respond to their care, their love, their commitment to a life of honest labor. They built a legacy, not of wealth or power, but of kindness, of compassion, of a deep and abiding connection to the land, to the community, to each other. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the ranch house, their hair now silvered with age, their faces etched with the lines of time, of laughter, of shared hardship, they watched the sunset, the sky ablaze with color, a breathtaking panorama of beauty and peace. Jesse took Lori's hand, his fingers, still strong despite the years, intertwining with hers. He looked at her, his eyes, still bright with that familiar spark, filled with a love that had endured the trials of time, of betrayal, of violence. "We made it, Lori," he said, his voice soft, his touch gentle. "We built a good life." She smiled, her eyes shining with tears of joy, of gratitude, of a love that had only deepened with the passing years. "We did, Jesse," she said. "We did it together." They sat there, hand in hand, watching the last rays of the sun disappear below the horizon, the sky darkening, the stars beginning to emerge, twinkling like diamonds scattered across a velvet cloth. They had faced storms, weathered hardships, overcome obstacles, their love a constant guide, their courage a shield, their hope a beacon in the darkness. They had found redemption, not just for Jesse, but for themselves, for their community, for the land they loved. They had built a legacy of love, of forgiveness, of second chances, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome even the darkest of shadows, to find peace, to find purpose, to find home. And as the night enveloped them, they knew that their journey, though nearing its end, had been a journey worth taking, a love worth fighting for, a life worth living. Their story, a testament to the enduring P.